All right, we are officially live. We'll give it a second here for folks to trickle in, always at the top of the hour. Catherine, I am excited to chat, as always.
Yes, definitely. Always good to be part with the accounting team.
Yeah, I know we've done a lot together. We should be collabing on even more content together. But
Yes,
as folks start to trickle in here, what we'll be doing here is very typical for most of our webinars that we are now doing weekly. We're going to be sharing this out with everybody that attends, so don't worry if you miss anything. We are recording it. You should be getting that out hopefully tomorrow, so you can dive in. There's a Q&A section at the bottom, and if you have any questions as we're getting things going, feel free to weigh in, throw them in there, and we'll try to cover as many of them as we can. I've actually already gotten some questions from folks before we even kicked off, so I think this is going to
great.
be a really, really fun one. So, Catherine, why don't we go ahead and just dive right in? Why don't you start with a little bit of your background? Because I think that of all the folks that I know that have a RevOps background, I think yours is a little bit unique, and I'd say aspirational for a lot of the folks that we at least chat with as they think about trying to get to the C-suite. So I'll let you take us away.
Yes. So good to be here today. Very, very excited to be talking about benchmarking. But in terms of myself, so I lead OPEX Engine. We're an independent subsidiary of Bain and Company. It's the consulting firm. And what we do is we provide tech companies and tech investors with performance benchmarks to drive their decisions. And how did I come to that? Well, early in my career, which is how I met Josh and team, I was a revenue operations leader and also a growth strategy leader at various SaaS companies. And so, of course, I think for those of you that in these roles, you rely very heavily on benchmarks to drive performance and also just make smarter decisions. And now at OPEX Engine, I get to take that firsthand experience and I'm now sitting on their side. So I get to help operators access the data and the insights that I once depended on. And my goal really is to make sure that the data we have isn't just data. The data should be giving operators practical benchmarks that they can actually use to make decisions. That's a very important thing for me to make sure that that data is going to drive action at the end of the day. So that's a little brief of kind of how I went from revenue operations to now running a company.
Amazing. I'm sure we're going to dive a little bit deeper into like the career side here as we get going, but
Yeah.
let's spend a little bit of time talking about benchmarking. When I was working in finance, this came up a lot, the idea of benchmarking. I'd say on the operations side, it came up a little bit less.
Hmm.
When companies say that they want to benchmark, what are they often misunderstanding about what benchmarks actually are?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think one of the things I would generally say in what I've learned being on the other side and like running a benchmarking company is it's it's a lot more nuanced and complicated than even I thought it was using benchmarks. And I think one of the nuances that the companies often kind of misunderstand is that there's benchmarks and there's case studies and they're actually different. So case study is when you say, "Oh, I want to know like everything there is to know about how my one or two direct competitors, like everything about their go-to-market motion. I want to know how many partners they have and like what's their strategy, like what's their priorities, right? What's their ICP, how's it different from mine, right? You go really, really deep into one or two companies for a specific reason. Benchmarks are different from that. Benchmarks are a broader average, so to speak. It's not always the mean, but like a broader average of performance metrics across a set of comparable companies. So you're using the comparability and kind of the size of the set of companies you're using that as a way to say, here's kind of here's what the companies in our industry are doing, which is different than the case study. And in terms of like when you use them, I kind of started talking about that a little bit.
Yeah.
With benchmarks, you can only get so granular because you want more than two companies in your benchmark, right? The average of two companies is not that interesting. So if you really need to know something super granular, like how many channel AEs do I have to hire to cover these three specific large partners? and I'm a tech company and I'm in the, I'm serving real estate agencies, right? Like that's not something you're going to get a benchmark for because you are probably one of, I don't know, 2 or 3 companies in the world that do this. And so that's where you want to use a case study because it's like one unique data point. That's like a unique choice that a specific company made. So that's where I think the benchmarking and the case studies often, because we will get people coming to us and be like, oh, well, why don't you know everything about a go-to-market motion for my one competitor? I'm like, that's not benchmarking, right?
Yeah, slightly different use cases.
Yes, it's a different use case.
So like I mentioned, when I was in ops, I joined a Series A business. We didn't have benchmarking at the time, at least nothing kind of proactively, at least. Like when is the right time for somebody that's at a company today to start to think about benchmarking?
Yeah, so there's a couple of use cases that we often see for the customers that we work with. One of the things I'd say, actually following on from the what is a benchmark, is these are all cases where you want guidelines, right? They're not for what I will never say that a use case is exact target setting. Like you never want to say the benchmark says 23%, and that is now the target for the year. The benchmarks, because they're an average, are meant to be guidelines, right? They're swim lanes. But if you want to be slightly on the left side of the lane, you want to be more on the right side of the lane, you want to be a different lane, like fine. It's not it's not a target, it's just where the lane lines are. And because of that, the main use cases we see for it, especially with RevOps folks, is one is just building or checking your plans, like confirming your planning. And I always think of this as avoiding the blank page problem. I
Mhm.
think we've all had this, having to plan for the year. I literally just did this for OPEX Engine, right, 6 months ago, where I'm like, all right, great. Here's how this year is ending up. I have some historical information. Like, what do I put as the numbers for next year? Of course, I could just roll them forward. Like, sure, I could do like a linear, like it's grown 5% per year on this cost. I'll just keep going. And that could work. And that works if you're in a super stable industry and your company's super stable. That almost never happens, right? Especially if you're talking about tech. So you're faced with this. You're like, all right, so I want to grow 20% next year, and I'm suddenly going to be a company that is $120 million instead of $100 million, and I've never seen what that looks like. And it's even more difficult if you're told, all right, now we want the 3 or 5 year plan. And at that point, you're a $300 million company, and that's really, really far from what you know. And so benchmark's really good for that because you can look up and say, all right, $300 million companies that grow 20% and that are profitable. Like, what does their resource allocation structure look like? And it just gives you a nice starting point to do your planning. The kind of the the extra like bonus part, I would say, or sort of the expert use case with that is after building the planning, benchmarks is also useful for getting alignment on the plan. Again, I think being in RevOps, a lot of RevOps leaders have probably had this issue where you have you have the data, right? You go to the stakeholder, and you have to convince the stakeholder, often someone that is not in one of the revenue orgs that you work with all the time and is not in your reporting line, and you have to convince them that whatever you've put as a plan is the right number. And so having this external view of saying like, hey, we need to grow 20 AEs next year. Well, how do you know it's 20? Well, based on our historical growth, but also a company of $200 million should have this many AEs. And so we're triangulating those. And now that's how we get 20. That really helps drive alignment across the board.
Yeah, I think driving alignment, one of the biggest challenges RevOps teams face day in and day out. And I think having that, quantitative backdrop to just at least point folks to is really helpful. So let's fast forward a little bit maybe and say, okay, we recognize that like benchmarking is going to be helpful for both planning and operating in the business.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm in RevOps, how should I think about getting started? Like what's the first step in maybe benchmarking well?
Yeah. So I think point like point in time benchmarking is definitely useful if you just need something quick, right? Like when I in one of my past roles, I had to put together a RevOps team plan. Right? Didn't really have a RevOps team to figure out, and for things like that, just getting like one general. I think I got a data point from our investors. It was like you basically have like one RevOps person to 11 AEs. Like, okay, that's kind of like a nice general guideline. So sometimes all you need is just like the little hint of something. But if you're looking at something, if you're looking at something broader where you are either planning something more holistic, or you are doing something that is a cross functional thing, definitely something you're doing it several years out. There's a couple of steps that we guide a lot of our customers through. So the first one is make sure you choose the right comparison cohort for you, right? And this is where the case study versus benchmarking thing really matters. We get a lot of people saying, again, to use the example I had, oh, we are a tech company that serves real estate agencies. I want a cohort of other tech companies that serve real estate agencies. And that totally makes sense on the surface until you dig into it and you realize, okay, so we are a $50 million company growing 100% a year serving real estate agencies. The other two tech companies are $1 billion and, $3 billion, and they're growing 2% a year. They're going to be making very different decisions than you. They're going to have a very different resource allocation. Like, those are not the benchmarks to go with, right? So make sure you choose the right comparison. And we've done a statistical analysis that says the things that drive a lot of the resource allocation metrics the most are your growth stage. So what size you are, how fast you're growing, and your margin. Are you 100% and you're fine being negative 20% margins? Are you growing 10% and you really need 40% margins? Those are going to change your resource allocation a lot. Yeah.
It makes a ton of sense. Like maybe once you figured out like what your peer group is and you kind of have split the world between, your case studies that you probably should be looking at as well, but now you've got
Right.
your kind of like benchmark cohort. Like how do you decide which metrics you should be tracking and looking at? And does that differ by stage or size of business at all?
Sorry, I actually broke up a tiny bit in the middle of the question.
I just say, like, how do you decide which metrics you should be
Yeah.
looking at and which ones matter? And do they change based on like size or stage of company?
Um, they definitely change a little bit, I would say, in the sense of the larger you get, I'm sure people in the audience have had this experience too. The larger you get, the more metrics you have to a certain extent, just the more granular you are able to get with your data. I actually genuinely we tend not to work with companies who are like $1 or $2 million because you don't have your own data to compare against. Like, what are you benchmarking?
Yeah,
You know, right?
like just do more.
Yeah, exactly. Just keep adding to the top line. You're good, right? And you're probably VC funded, and they also don't care about how much you're spending really. So just keep adding to the top line, and you're good to go. So I think in terms of the right metrics, I think one of them is you got to have the right internal data to compare, and whether that's you already have it or you need to tweak your P&L reporting so you can be measuring the right things so you can benchmark later. That's very important. And then I think when you're looking past that, again, I get back to the driving action and driving decisions, right? You want to benchmark the things that actually drive your business decisions.
Hmm.
And I think, things like obviously FTE numbers, costs, etc. We'll occasionally get questions where it's like I just had one this morning. It was asking about, well, like what's the average like contract value here? And that might drive a business decision for a specific company. In the case of this company, it's kind of just like something they want to know. I was like, well, what are you going to do? Does that matter for you? Like, is that going to change how you do your contracts or how many sales probably not, right? They were more, what was more useful for them was like a sales org type of look.
Interesting. I feel like that's something that I struggled with in the past when I was thinking about doing benchmarking. It's like there's the curiosity questions, if you will,
Yes,
which are like, I would love to know what this looks like, but am I going to do anything with it? Like
right.
maybe not. But obviously, like there's a lot of value in applying benchmarking throughout the business. Like, how should leaders be thinking about applying benchmarks throughout the business to make them actually useful and actionable and not just the curiosity? Although, again, I do love those
Yes.
personally.
I mean, look, if you're just curious about something, which was kind of this email thread that's going back and forth on this morning, like, sure, great. It's always like I'm also like curious about things as well. But I think in terms of applying it, the big thing I say is you have these swim lanes, right? Your strategic priorities will dictate where you are in or outside of those swim lanes. And this is why I say it's not a target. If you look at the benchmarks and it says for your growth stage and your margin and everything, you should be spending 23% of your revenue on sales people. And you look at that and you're like, okay, I get it, but I know my priorities, I know my industry is maybe very, very relationship heavy. So I need to make sure that I'm actually going to spend 30% because I know that RAEs are more expensive than kind of the industry, like the general SaaS industry average. I know, so they need to be from that industry that my end users are from or whatever it is, right? These are like very
Yep.
specific business things that only and actually it's something you can get from case studies a little bit, right? Like this is where the two kind of combine there. I think though, I will say, I think one nice thing about SaaS, and it's why OPEX Engine exists, is I think for people on this call who've been at multiple SaaS companies, especially in ops, I see this too. A lot of the fundamental metrics are very, very similar. Not just the metrics themselves, but actually the value of the metrics, right? Like when you look at what percentage of your revenue you should be spending on sales, like there's kind of a general range that everyone should be in, regardless of whether you're selling to real estate companies or manufacturing companies or whatever, which is it's a good thing for being able to use broader comparisons.
Yeah, in a former life, when I was doing a lot more public comparables, we would actually just group a lot of the SaaS businesses together,
Yeah.
regardless of industry. It was all these are vertical SaaS metrics. They're going to be by and large the same. Maybe using your example, I'm going to ask you to go back in time to when you were leading a RevOps team. We have this metric and we say or benchmark that 20% of our spend should be on sales and marketing. In reality, let's say it's at 40%, or you think it
Mm-hmm.
should be 40% based on what you're seeing in the business. How do you communicate that to leadership when it's so divergent from like what you're
Yeah.
seeing?
Um, I think it really gets to you have to unpack why there's that 20 percentage point difference, right? And this is where I think um, I talked about, oh, just having the one data point versus getting more detailed data points. Having the one data point that says 20% is only partially helpful in this case.
Yeah.
Having the things below that say, okay, companies that are doing 20%, this is how many AEs they have. This is, how much they spend on marketing, right? Maybe they spend a lot more on marketing and that's what's happening, right? But having it next level down, so you have to understand the kind of the path from what the number says to where you are today. And then I always go back to it's the strategic priorities, right? It's if you are at 40% and you know the company is a grow at all costs strategic priority for the next 3 years, might not be something that's worth spending a lot of your time pushing, right? You just want to make sure the top
Yeah.
line number goes. If it's 40% and you know there is a margin or cost target coming up, that is definitely something worth pushing and like tying to that, right? Even though they might not be looking at it, like, hey, I know that we're trying to get our margins better. I found there's this discrepancy. It seems to show up in X, Y, and Z under the cupboard.
Yeah, it makes total sense. I'm really curious. AI is one of the more fun
Mm.
topics that we come into all of the time. It feels like we've had more change from a business model and potentially margin perspective in the past maybe 2 years than we had in the past 10. Knowing the benchmarks in the past 10, again, I could imagine where we're like getting those refreshed and updated would be really helpful. I have to think that right now it's changing so fast that like keeping up with what the latest and greatest are is really difficult for most teams. Like, how have you seen kind of like benchmarking change in the past couple of years, even with some of the rise of kind of AI? Has there been a change, or is it really kind of continue to stick to the fundamentals?
A bit of both. I think the fundamentals still matter, right? You're not suddenly benchmarking some completely new metric. I will say, as a general thing, we have seen a lot more focus on efficiency versus growth,
Hmm.
right? So even myself, like when I was a RevOps leader, there was a lot more conversation about like, well, what's the sales capacity to get to this level of growth, as opposed to now it's not just a straight line like, oh, this is the productivity they used to have, take that, divide that into the growth number, and that's the number of capacity you have. Now it's, well, wait, let's look at that productivity number first and see if we can get that up and actually do more with less. So I think that's changed. Um, we actually, interestingly, we in a couple of days we're coming out with an article about how you measure the impact of AI
Hmm.
in a SaaS business. And the key point of that is, yes, there are ways you need to change what you're measuring, in the sense of making sure that you are carving out your revenue in different ways, carving out your costs. But at the end of the day, once you have those inputs right, and this is that within your CRM or whatever you're using for RevRec, right, those systems, once you have that correct, you're still kind of measuring the same metrics in the day, right? So if you let's say you carve out, like what your AI costs are and your revenue from your AI products, great. You're still going to do a revenue divided by costs productivity. Like that still is, it's just got a little AI tag on it.
Yeah. So you're saying that the P&L itself hasn't actually changed. Maybe some of the numbers in it and where lines are maybe has slightly, but the fundamentals are still the fundamentals.
The fundamentals, you just have to make sure that you are tagging things in a conscious way. And I think one of the things that um, we added kind of last minute to the article, as I was thinking about it and rereading it, is this is again a fundamental. It's always been true, but it's even more true in AI, which is once you decide on the KPIs for your company, you have to make sure that they are reviewed consciously at a pretty frequent clip, especially now. So just because you don't want a KPI to stick around, and a way to measure that just because it's how it's always been done, because suddenly you're going to find yourself a year or two down the path and you're like, I actually don't know what happened with AI.
Totally. It's something that we see a lot right now. I think when we even first started with accounting 3 years ago, a lot of folks were thinking about annual planning. And what we're seeing now is the pace of annual planning is actually just too slow for a lot of these companies. And like we're seeing folks do it
Yes.
much more frequently, even quarterly in some cases, where just like looking at where are benchmarks, what are the KPIs in the business on just like a much more frequent basis has become pretty table stakes. I think it's also particularly the case for software businesses where gross margins are now maybe no longer in the high 80s if you start to factor
Yeah.
in the cost of AI.
Yes, that is totally true.
And so we're starting to see quite a bit more of that on kind of our side. Well, Kevin, I mean, this has been fantastic. I think we can talk about benchmarking and just probably business and
Yes.
RevOps for hours and hours and hours, and we have. Maybe as we think about like where to leave things, any kind of major pitfalls to avoid if someone's looking to do benchmarking and RevOps for
Yeah.
kind of like the first time. We talked about the case study side versus benchmarking, but anything else that you see as kind of like common, maybe missteps that might trip some folks up?
Yeah, so I think just emphasizing what I said about make sure you have the right comparison for your growth stage. Don't anchor too heavily on um, your exact kind of end user model. And then the other thing I would say is be the extent you can, be picky about knowing what the source of the data is. If you just want the one like general, like it's 20% of your revenue number, great. Like there's a lot of stuff out there for that. But if you really want to use it holistically for planning, I think know where that data is coming from.
I love that. Yeah, I think the quality of data here matters tremendously.
Yeah.
And that was one of the biggest hangups we always had when I was doing this in banking was like we were always trying to get to the highest quality data possible because it just swings things so wildly. So I think
And
that
also
makes
actually the definition, right, of the
hmm,
metrics. So that's one thing that so the way OPEX Engine works is we get the data directly from the companies that work with us. And we always once we get the data in, it always takes us at least a week to just go back and forth with whoever submitted the data, usually the finance team, and figure out, well, when you say sales expense, what's in there looks a little bit different. And it turns out, oh, actually CS is also in there.
yeah.
Right. And things like that. And it's like you gotta make sure and I think knowing that you have that confidence in the data is great, but sometimes when you find these things that are just general numbers, you're like, okay, so 20%, but what does that include?
100%. Yeah, getting to apples, like obviously
Yeah.
critical here, and I think it's something that we see overlooked a lot of the time too. So, Katherine, this is awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time out, sharing more on benchmarking, sharing more on OPEX Engine. If folks have questions about benchmarking just generally, or maybe even your career path, like what's the best
Yeah.
place to find you? LinkedIn?
LinkedIn, my email's pretty easy. It's Katherine@opexengine.com. Happy to answer questions about any of this, about career stuff, but please reach out.
Amazing. Well, Katherine, really appreciate it. As always with these, thank you so much. We'll be sharing the recording with everybody in case you want to go back and review, share it with anybody else that you have. But let's do it again here soon. This has been so fun.
Awesome. Has been very fun. Thanks, Josh.
Amazing. All right, take care. See you,
Bye.
everybody.